pleasure to be here today. It is kind of a strange situation to have to do these meetings, but that's the reality right now. So talking about trying to do prescribed burn planning, and particularly looking at some of the liability issues and really thinking about contingencies is really an important thing to do now. In Georgia, when we do our prescribed fire council or prescribed burn certification, we talk about planning the burn and doing a written plan as kind of the culmination of all of the factors that you need to put together for to do a successful burn. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, and particularly look at some of the things that we need to be concerned with, kind of the what ifs, liability, some of those types of issues. And so, you know, obviously when we're looking at doing a planning process, there's a wide range of things that we can do with that. If you work for an agency, you've got some very specific guidelines on what you have to do. For many of us, however, you know, we don't have that formalized process. And, you know, in some cases, you may not have to actually have a written plan in hand to execute a burn. We always have pushed that as being one of the important factors to have as kind of the, you know, the reasonable and prudent thing to do in terms of planning and executing the burn is to have that written plan. And it's a great process to look at all of the aspects of the burn, and particularly today, you know, consider alternatives, things that possibly could go wrong, and formulate a plan to try to give you the best results. There's lots of great tools out there now that can go into this. And so, you know, we've always maintained that the success of that burn depends on that approach or plan, and try to evaluate as many things as you can with that. You know, the planning process basically kind of allows you to sit down and think about things. It serves as a checklist, provides justification, probably one of the most important things you need to look at. You know, why are we actually out there burning? What kind of differences do we expect, and how are we going to determine whether or not we've met those goals? You know, one-day burning blocks, getting that burn done during daylight hours is typically one of the most important things we've got to do. And, you know, being able to break up a piece of property into those blocks is important, and you need to do that, obviously, before you get out there and start stringing fire in the stand. Setting priorities is important, and as I mentioned, this is really all about kind of liability. You know, are you going to be able to get that burn accomplished safely for all involved, meet the objectives that you're looking for, and basically just kind of take care of business? And that's all going to come out with some type of prescription that will give you the way of implementing that fire on the landscape. One of the things that we definitely need to look at, and we saw some interesting measurements and evaluation in the previous talk, but, you know, looking at that stand, quite often I find some folks that, particularly where they've burned areas in the past, that they assume things are like they were the last time. Every year is different. Weather conditions, as we saw the differences in the acres burned that Shan was showing over the last few years, you know, every year is going to be different, and that impacts the fuels and things that we find in those stands. So it's really important each time to go back and document those stand conditions. You know, what kind of fuels have we got out there, the distributions, the concerns that we have in trying to get the burn implemented to meet the objectives that we're looking for out there. One of the things that over the last few years particularly have been important is looking at, you know, unique things that might be happening in the stand that could create some issues for you. You know, needle drape, things like that, you know, can be kind of spectacular if you don't realize they're in the stand. You know, it may or may not require some special conditions under which you burn. All that has to be looked at, though, before you get out there and start stringing fire. Invasive species, one of the things I've been involved with for a number of years. Most of these are have some type of a fire interaction, and unfortunately, most of them are not good. Kogon grass, for example, really extreme fire behavior that we have with that type of species. And quite often, you know, if we assume things are just like, quote, normal fuels that we might find, you know, we're going to have a real issue when the fire gets into those types of complexes. So again, paying attention, going out and actually looking at those stands a little bit more closely on a year-to-year basis is really going to be an important factor in planning that burn. And it may actually dictate how you're going to apply fire within that stand. In fact, most cases it is. One interesting factor is that, you know, in some cases, fire may actually make the problem worse. Something like shrubby lespedeza actually increases the species abundance because of the scarification of the hard-coated seed that's deposited by the plants. So if we're trying to manage a system with prescribed fire, in this case, repeated fires only makes the problem that we may be trying to solve even worse. So we've got to realize that fire is one component of the management, but it can't necessarily be the single component in something like this. We've got to do some other control work in order to achieve the overall objective of that stand condition we're looking for. So again, going in and paying attention on a yearly basis, evaluating the differences that we have in terms of the weather conditions and how they impact the fuels is going to be a very important feature with this. Some of the other things that we need to look at, particularly for some of the liability issues that we could run into, you know, if we're managing for certain things within the stand, snags are one of those. You know, if we have an issue where we've got, we don't protect them, try to maintain them, they can create issues where we might have some spotting over the lines. You know, in a situation like this, it's probably not good to try to manage snags right next to a fire break or something like that, because this is quite often what happens with a situation like that. You know, if something like this goes down in the middle of the stand, that's not an issue, but where we've got issues around the perimeter, you know, we need to pay some attention to those kinds of things to reduce some of our liability with that. Another important factor to look at, and you know, sometimes these things just kind of slip through the cracks that we don't realize that we've got these issues within the stand until it's too late. You know, when you're looking at utilities and things like that that might be within the stands, we've got to be very careful with our use of fire around there and be sure to protect and not allow something like this to happen. There's a whole lot of folks that get very upset when these types of issues occur. You know, probably on a more common basis, you can see the fence row here, where we've got the burn up into the fences, you know, damaging those resources. So we've got some extra costs that can be incurred there, and particularly if you're burning up to adjacent properties, you know, those kinds of issues are important things to look at and consider when you look at the planning operations. Burning under power lines. A lot of us have properties that have large power lines through them, and we may burn those open areas for wildlife habitat and things like that. And realize that smoke buildup can actually cause discharges from those high voltage lines, and so we do need to be very careful, particularly if it's been a situation where we've got you know, a lot of invasive species or something like Kogon grass that might be growing up under there, or other fuels that you know, could create a situation where we could get that potential discharge. So again, you know, looking at some of those issues, being aware of what you've got on the property, it's going to be very important during your planning process. Other factors that we often talk about, you know, first burns and old stands where, you know, fire has been excluded for a long time period, where we've got litter buildup, things where a fire can not have a very visible impact, but can creep and smolder, particularly around the base of the trees, can cause a lot of resource damage and loss of trees in the subsequent burn or subsequent to the burn. So those are issues that you need to be aware of. And again, we're looking at trying to develop a prescription and firing techniques that will kind of protect those resources that we've got out there. So paying attention to those is very important. One of our biggest issues, of course, is smoke. And, a reasonable and prudent thing to do in planning a burn is to really do a good evaluation of what your smoke management issues are going to be and the impacts that you could possibly have based on the fuels and other things in the stand. Being aware of potential issues. Here we've got some debris piles with lots of soil in them. If this catches on fire, we're going to have a control issue because it's going to be hard to put out. We're going to have smoldering issues, which means that burn probably, or that fire and smoke is going to last into the night and create conditions where we've got poor smoke dispersion and potential problems. If we are looking at trying to do something with large debris piles and logging decks, things such as that, and that's part of our burn part of our burn objective, that we need to take some special take a special look at those types of things and be able to ignite those piles early in the burning day so that we can try to get them burned as completely and out during the daylight hours as possible. Have equipment there that we can work the piles if necessary. The last thing we want to do is have a fire creep in and set something like this on fire late in the day. So again, realizing what you've got out there, making those plans in order to take care of that is going to be an important factor in your planning process. There might have to be a little bit of hand-holding and education, particularly for some landowners, particularly if they've got something like this where they've got cankers where we know we're going to get some fire on some of those spaces. So a little bit of pre-warning to the landowner that they may see some damage or this is something that might occur is possibly a good thing to look at in your PR with your planning and execution of that burn. Again, smoke management, look at the issues that you might have and whether or not that's going to be a factor. Large debris on the site, heavy fuels, mop-up is going to be important in some of these characteristics. When we get into a situation where we've got something like wildland urban interfaces, the planning process and potential liability issues really jump with these types of things where we've got both smoke, we've got particulate material, possible spot overs, a whole host of things can happen at these urban interfaces. So, that planning process really takes a whole other step in terms of a lot of work potentially with the landowners adjacent to the burn, a lot more PR that needs to be done in order to successfully get that burn accomplished. Ultimately, we're trying to achieve some objective, and we need to think about how we're going to measure that objective as well. There's a whole host of reasons to burn, and a single burn can actually give us a host of potential benefits out on the site. Generally, we're looking at a couple of these, or maybe some others that may not even be on the list here. But we need to try to determine how well we did with that burn and whether or not, we actually met that goal. And some of that can be done during the burn, right after the burn, or even during the burn, but a lot of it may come later. If we're doing hardwood control, we've got an objective of trying to reduce some amount of competition. We may not be going in and putting plots in, but we can get some general ideas of what we've done. When we start looking at what we really want to get out of this burn, one thing that we need to think about is, can we actually do what we want to? This is the time to start looking at some of the constraints that we might have in terms of actually being able to get that burn done. And during the planning process, that's the best time to do it. One of the good things that I like to do when I sit down with these is to start looking at maps, you know, line out the burn unit, you know, the typical things, the boundaries, ownership, you know, start thinking about how we're going to actually apply fire into that area and develop those one-day burning blocks. There's lots of great resources now to allow you to do mapping, and you can start sitting down and playing some games with what you want to do with this. You know, here's an example of coming in, lining out a stand. We've got a couple of areas that we've got some issues with. You know, here's a Bermuda grass understory and an adjacent landowner stand. We've got a big pine straw production area right here. So we can start playing some games in terms of how do we want to try to apply fire to this? And, you know, in this particular instance, we've got a northwest wind. We can set something up like this and really look and see if we think this is going to work. You know, another option here would be to take a southwest prefrontal wind and burn from a different direction. So, you know, we can look at these kinds of things during the planning process to get a better idea of how we really want to apply fire to meet our objectives on these sites and protect the resources that we have out there. And probably the biggest thing that we need to look at is our smoke screening plan. And that's something that needs to be, you know, taken care of and really evaluated for these burns. You know, that's one of the reasons why we've got a lot of our certification programs and our permit systems is the impacts of smoke from burns. And so this is a very serious thing. You know, in Georgia, we're fortunate that we've got great weather forecasting, great weather information from the Forestry Commission. We've got the ability to use V-Smoke, which allows us to pull in mapping, delineate out our site, look at the fuels, make a good prediction based on all of those factors and the type of burns that we want to try to do, to look at the impacts of our smoke. And this is really something that needs to be with that plan to show that, in particular, that you've done that reasonable and prudent job of evaluating and trying to predict where you might have an issue with smoke. So this is one of those things that definitely should go along with that plan. And there are great tools now that are available to make this really a fairly easy thing to add in and do the evaluation. And then, of course, we're going to get a prescription that tells us how we can try to use some techniques to achieve our objectives. And then, you know, these are the standard things where we've got a whole host of things that we can use in terms of burning. You know, these have specific considerations to look at that we can start entering into that plan. And once we get to that point, we can set up our priorities for our burns. All of these are going to be a little bit different depending on the characteristics of the stands that we have and, you know, what we need to do. But again, that's part of the planning process to try to reduce some of the liability that we have. And again, remember that every year is different. And, you know, you may or may not be able to do what you did the last time you burned. But get that down on paper, put those maps together, get your fire plan together. You know, again, there are maybe, if you're working with an agency, you've got a specific program and things that you need to go through to do that. But there are lots of resources in almost all the states to be able to put together a fairly complete plan for prescribed burning that allows you to do the evaluation, follow up the execution, you know, be able to inform your crews on how to do the burning, those types of things. And then also think about evaluation. You know, what do you need to do after the fire has been set and you're trying to wrap things up? So look at your pre-burn prep. Look at the fire behavior during the burn. That's a great time to learn and play around with some techniques if you need to. You know, we've got great opportunities to take weather information during those burns so you can kind of understand what's going on with the changing weather conditions. And then obviously we're going to evaluate that burn in post-burn. You know, how did things go? Did we scorch? Did we have an escape? Did we have a smoke management violation? Did everything go great? You know, those are the kinds of things we need to do. And again, there may be some hand-holding again with landowners to, you know, assure them that, you know, things may be better than they look in some cases. We may have to follow up a little bit later. You know, we're looking at hardwood control. We may have to come back during the growing season or later in the growing season to see exactly how well our burn actually achieved the goals that we're looking for. But all these are important features that you need to think about when you're doing the planning process and be able to record that information and use it as a good learning tool. You know, what kind of response are we going to get where we've got some ground scorch? You know, come back in, follow those up, see what happened, try to do better the next time if there was an issue. You know, those are all great learning tools that can be part of that. So, you know, when we look at issues with red flag situations, you know, one of the biggest things is we don't have that written plan where we've sat down and tried to go through those factors to look at all the contingencies, look at things that could cause us a problem and try to figure out how we're going to deal with those and mitigate them or eliminate them. So, you know, doing that written plan, smoke management, all of those issues are really an important feature to look at while you're trying to do your burn plan. All right, have we got some questions?
All right, anybody have any questions out there? Type them in to the Q&A. There's a really hard one here. David, I don't know if I should give you this one. Heather wants to know, when the National Weather Service is down, where else can you look for weather? And that's a tough one because we do rely on the National Weather Service a lot to get, you know, the hourly forecast, the relative humidity, all those fire weather factors. Do you have any ideas for her?
You know, there's a number of, that is, when that goes down, that's a real problem. And I don't know that I've got a great, reliable answer for that. There are a number of weather apps and things that are out there, but they all typically have ties into those things. So, you know, right. It's kind of hard to say if that goes down, then you've got, you know, a good alternative for that. You know, one thing, and oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, you're probably gonna prompt me. You know, one thing that we had talked about was, particularly with this strange season that we're in right now, is looking at you know, COVID issues, and there are guidelines that are out there. Bo talked about some of the things that they, you know, had to deal with, and so, you know, even more so until we get out of this, the planning process is going to have to look at including those kinds of things on how you're going to deal with moving crews and personnel in particular to a particular site to keep them safe during COVID. And then also certainly issues with smoke management become very important if you're impacting schools, nursing homes, hospitals, those things, even more so than before with potential issues. So that's one of the things that, you know, sitting down and thinking about these and planning out for contingencies is really going to be important with this now.
Yeah, David, and I really appreciate the way you kind of broke it all down. And, you know, I never burn without a plan. For simplicity's sake, you just get all your ducks in a row. You think about your objectives. You think about your weather, what kind of weather you want. And, you know, the post-burn kind of stuff, you can always go back to your plan and say, hey, you know, I burned the stand at 35% RH, and I didn't really get the fire effects that I want. So the next time I burn in 2 years, 3 years, I think I'll change that to 30%, make it a little bit a hotter day. So it's a really good tool.
You wouldn't have remembered that either.
Exactly.
You know, you go back, well, let's see now, what did I do 2, 3, 4 years ago? You know, so again, having that plan. And for a lot of folks, particularly, and again, if you're, you know, with an agency, you've got to do those things. But, you know, for some consultants and other managers who are doing some burning, you know, that plan isn't always necessary as part of what they have to do, but it's a great tool, you know, to justify what you're doing. If you're doing work for a landowner, here's the document that shows what we're going to do and how we did it. And, it shows, how they're managing their land and gives you the opportunity to learn and do better the next time, hopefully.
Yeah, and someone asked, like, how big do these plans need to be, and is there any specific template? I mean, they can range from a one-page plan to, if you're a Fed, 100-page tome.
Exactly, yeah.
And they're all covering the same kind of kernels, like you.
They are. They're in. All that information is pretty standard. I mean, you can get easily a 1 or 2 page plan that will have the very basics that need to be in there. As I said, adding to that a map. A map that shows what you're trying to do and where you're trying to do it is a great tool to work with your crew so they know exactly what's going on with that burn. Don't leave them in the dark by explaining things that are kind of abstract. Give them a map so they know what's going on. So the map should be there. And that smoke management plan showing that document, that should be attached to it as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad you did some screenshots of V-Smoke. It can be kind of scary if you're not used to it, but it really is just clicking through a few
pages. It's pretty easy now.
Answering some questions that you probably already know, and then it gives you that output of where your smoke is going to go for that day. Super easy tool to use. And you can find more information at Southern Fire Exchange.
There you are. That's exactly
right. Great place
right.
to learn about. And you mentioned some other places to learn about burn. I think you stole some graphics from this thing.
Oh, yes.
This is a Forest Service publication. You can order it from Forest Service, or you can download a PDF, but it's got great kernels of what needs to go into your burn planning.
And that's got a great 1-page burn plan in there, too.
There you go, a great template that you can use. Someone asked about the training certification. I think probably the certified burners. Right now, there's nothing on the books because of the pandemic, but we're hoping next spring. So, stay in touch with the Georgia Forestry Commission, their website. When those classes become available, you'll hear about that. Also, Southern Fire Exchange is always getting information out about things like that. So when those classes come back online, if you're tapped into SFE, you're going to hear about it. Anything else you want to add there, Dave? Let me see what other questions we have. Oh, wait. National Weather Service guy just chimed in. This is awesome. Okay. He says we can provide a good set of links outside of us, but the best answer, if you're having trouble with National Weather Service the day of your burn, call your local National Weather Service office. They are open 24/7, and they think that prescribed burning is a public safety issue, that they are very interested in talking with you and getting you that weather that you need for the day. So thank you, Steve, for that. Appreciate it.
Sounds good. Great.
Awesome. And okay, I think we need to do our next polling question, Lisa. Now, I'm really hoping for 100% here, but answer this honestly. If you burn, we want to know honestly, if you burn, do you use a written plan to conduct your prescribed fires? And we have 403 people in the audience right now, so chime in with your answer. And the answer is, ooh, 3/4 yes. Only 7% no, and 18% sometimes. 1% never. So let me encourage you, as Bo did earlier, and Gary and David, we all encouraged everyone to get a burn plan, and it can be simple. It can be very simple, but just write that stuff down. Think about your burn, think about your weather, think about your smoke, and that'll help you run a much more effective burn. So I guess that's all we have. Back to you, Frank.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, David, for those information we all know to do. We just need to remind ourselves every time that it's important to have that plan before we go, and we should have done something different.